Hi everyone. So today I will be talking about my Humanities core project, which will be basically comparing and contrasting the two versions of Disney's The Jungle Book. So I have a presentation for you guys, so let's get into that. So the working title that I have for my project is The Evolution of the American Society Reflected by Disney's The Jungle Book. Now, as you can see here, I will be comparing the original one and the modern one. So again, like I just said, my primary sources will be the 1967 version and the 2016 remake. And the questions I will be answering throughout my project will be: how do the differences between the two versions reflect a change in society's mindsets and a progression of their values? What part do the animals play in showing these changes? What do these changes say about the Disney company itself? And so my thesis statement, or rather paragraph, is quite long, but this is what I have so far. Although the two versions of Disney's The Jungle Book may appear similar on a surface level, there are drastic differences regarding plot, representation, and overall message, revealing the way in which Disney is an accurate reflection of the evolution of the American society from the 1960s to modern times, as well as the mentalities and cultural beliefs of each film's audience. The way Mowgli and each of the animal characters are depicted reflects various types of people within the societies that each film was created within. How each archetype is portrayed reveals society's values and what perceptions they held of them. Despite Disney being a popular corporation throughout the decades due to its powerful reputation as a result of Walt Disney's influence, nowadays it does not attempt to influence people with its own principles and morals, but rather with ones that are already in place and clearly important to the American public. It is apparent that the 2016 version spends time fixing and making up for the offensive social injustices that were made by the 1967 film and, through the personification of animals, emphasizes the significance of prominent societal issues including race, the family structure, feminism, belonging, and proper leadership. So historical background and cultural context will be extremely important for my project because a lot of what goes on in the movies and the context behind what goes on in them has a lot to do with what was taking place during history or during modern times. So the time in which they were created is essentially really important. So there are major differences in American culture. There was a rise in activism and civil rights movement during the 1960s, especially for African Americans and feminism. And also conservatism was becoming less and less popular. Modern day values compared to back then have become much more progressive, and the concept of acceptance is regarded as more morally acceptable. So the acceptance of others and things that aren't necessarily traditional is definitely more morally acceptable nowadays and even expected. There's also differences in how Disney is run, the company itself, I mean. So during the 1960s, Walt Disney had direct involvement and control over what was going on and what was being created. In fact, The Jungle Book was the last film he had direct involvement with before he died. Nowadays, at least in 2016, the company is now enormous and nothing is controlled just by one person. There are executives and directors and CEOs that have control over kind of what goes on, but it's not just one person controlling the majority of things or having a direct influence over anything. So most of my scholarly contexts and journals and articles will be used for analysis of the two films, mainly just to support the points that I make in my analysis. Most of it will be comparing and contrasting the two, and I will be using several of the scholarly essays that are listed below as support for the points I make. So a lot of them talk about Disney's history and its effects on society. Some are strictly historical with no mention of Disney whatsoever, such as the last one listed, feminism. But except for that, all of them actually talk about Disney and how it has affected society, or rather how society has affected Disney itself. They're almost all tied together in one way or another, whether it has to do with, again, the Disney company and its films and creations, as well as the historical context behind a lot of them. I'll mostly talk directly about Disney and its influence and relations to society. So the engagement that I'll have with the scholarly articles that I'll be using will be to solely use them to support my analysis and claims that I make throughout my essay. I won't necessarily be disputing any because, like I said, a lot of, in fact, most of my essay, besides the historical context, will be about comparing and contrasting the two films rather than trying to dispute any claims that have already been made. So I'll essentially be kind of making my own claim rather than disputing any that has already been made. So some of the examples of the topics I'll be talking about will be how Disney has handled the presentation of various social issues and criticism from the 1960s compared to 2016 when the remake was created, how Disney is a tool for teaching morals and how it can often be a poor role model, especially to children, but as well as its journey to its more progressive nature nowadays. Also, how feminism is connected to the value of the family and how conservatives saw it and sometimes currently see it as a threat to the supposed traditional American culture. I'll also be talking about how Disney has had a racially problematic nature in the past and sometimes even now, and the fact that it a lot of times promotes white supremacy, as well as its lack of proper representation or lack of a lot of representation for many cultures at all. The conservative mindset of Walt Disney and his views of progressive ideologies as a threat to his lifestyle, which will definitely be reflected in the 1967 version since he had direct contact with the creation of it. Whether Disney's representations are morally right or wrong will also be something that I discuss, and what is kind of seen by society as morally right and wrong, depending on the time in which they were created. And finally, how Disney promotes an us versus them culture, meaning usually the American supposed culture versus really any others. So a large portion of my project will be the interpretation of my two primary sources, as well as the analysis of the context behind both of them and comparing and contrasting them. So there will be 5 major topics that I plan to talk extensively about, which are race, family structure, feminism, belonging and acceptance, which includes acceptance by other and both self-acceptance, and leadership. So obviously these two films aren't a factual history book, and they won't reflect everything that has gone on in the 1960s or 2016, but there are certain things that are exaggerated and underplayed in both versions, and those 5 topics are kind of the major things that are being presented in both that I would like to talk about. So for example, when I talk about race, I'll be talking a lot about the representation of African Americans and the Americanization of other cultures, such as Mowgli and Bagheera. For family structure, I'll be talking about how the elephants are portrayed in the original, especially, and their kind of militaristic family style, as well as Mowgli's family relationships with the various animals. And that one I will be comparing both the modern and the 1960s version. For feminism, I will be talking about the presence of Mowgli's love interest in the original and lack thereof in the modern version, and kind of what that says about how people perceive feminism back then versus now. The gender change of Ka compared to the 1967 version, because in the 60s, Ka is male, and in the modern version, Ka is female, as well as the role of Raksha, which is Mowgli's wolf mother. As for belonging and acceptance, I'll be talking about Mowgli's search for what he thinks is a new family in both versions, and the alienation towards him by all of the other animals and how they kind of don't want him around and think that he has a certain place in the world, which is especially portrayed in the original compared to the modern version. As for leadership, I'll be talking about the difference in leadership between Akela, Mowgli, King Louie, and Shere Khan, because all of them have significantly different leadership styles. Shere Khan and King Louie kind of like to rule in fear, especially in the modern one, Akila is more of a peaceful leader, and Mowgli develops his own form of leadership kind of along the way. So, most of my project will be about me analyzing each of the five topics that I mentioned and how they're presented differently compared to the times in which each film was created, and how it shows a clear change in the societal mindsets. But for my conclusion, I want to just offer some food for thought, such as why was the 1967 film so well received despite it being so problematic? And why do people still praise it even today? Maybe it has something to do with nostalgia, or still, maybe there's even some suppressed racism or prejudice. Could the remake be considered a cash grab disguised as an apology? In my essay, I will be talking a lot about how it is, in fact, an apology, but it may also be important to consider that money is involved, considering how big of a company Disney is. And lastly, does Disney actually care about the ethics of the situations they are presenting? Or are they more concerned with the public's approval no matter what morals are involved? I will be talking a lot about how Disney seems to reflect what the most popular mindset is nowadays, because there is not someone like Walt Disney to be in control and portray his own personal mindsets. So I also wanted to include some extras for you guys to check out if you want. The clips that I have linked on this page will be a lot of the clips that I'm talking about when I'm doing my analysis and will be using for my examples and kind of proof of what I'm talking about. So each one has to do with some of the five topics that I have mentioned: race, family structure, etc. So if you'd like to check that out and see what I will be talking about visually, then you can check these out. And then lastly, I have my works cited, of course. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy my project.